question is as follows. Mr. Poilievre, seconded by Mr. Motz, moved that the House declare that the Prime Minister convene a carbon tax emergency meeting with all of Canada's 14 First Ministers. May I dispense? That this meeting address A, the ongoing carbon tax crisis and the financial burden it places on Canadians. B, the Prime Minister's recent 23% carbon tax increase. C,
plans for provinces to opt out of the federal carbon tax to pursue other responsible ideas to lower emissions. Given that under the government's current environmental plan, Canada now ranks 62 out of 67 countries on the Climate Change Performance Index, and that this meeting be publicly televised and held within 5 weeks of this motion being adopted.
Amendment. Mr. Soroka, seconded by Mr. Steinley, moved the following amendment. That the motion be amended by deleting all the words after the word that and substituting the following. The House note, A, that the federal carbon tax is causing a debate in the country, and B, that while Quebec, British Columbia, and the Northwest Territories already have their own systems in place, the federal government mandates carbon tax policy. Que la Chambre demande au
that the House call on the Prime Minister to convene an emergency carbon tax and tarification meeting with all of Canada's 14 First Ministers, and that this meeting be publicly televised and held within 5 weeks of this motion being adopted. The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started, and the House will now proceed to the vote for members participating in person. All those in favour of the amendment will please rise.
Mr. Scheer.
Mr. Scheer.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Perkins.
Mrs. Thomas.
Mrs. Thomas.
Mr. Deltel.
Mr. Deltel.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mr. Pulis.
Mr. Pulis.
Ms. Landsman.
Ms. Landsman.
Ms. Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Ms. Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Mr. Barrett.
Mr. Barrett.
Mrs. Gray.
Mrs. Gray.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Brock.
Mr. Brock.
Mr. Berthold.
Mr. Berthold.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Workington.
Ms. Finley.
Ms. Finley.
Mr. Chong.
Mr. Chong.
Mr. Abultayev.
Mr. Abultayev.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mr. Seaback.
Mr. Seaback.
Ms. Ferrari.
Ms. Ferrari.
Mrs. Block.
Mrs. Block.
Mr. Strahl.
Mr. Strahl.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Macaulay Edmonton West.
Mr. Macaulay Edmonton West.
Mr. Lloyd.
Mr. Lloyd.
Mr. Brassard.
Mr. Brassard.
Mrs. Goodridge.
Mrs. Goodridge.
Madame Vien.
Madame Vien.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Tucker.
Mrs. Cramp Nyman.
Mrs. Cramp Nyman.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mr. Vidal.
Mr. Vidal.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Redicott.
Mr. Redicott.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Steinley.
Mr. Steinley.
Ms. Roux.
Ms. Roux.
Monsieur Lehoux.
Monsieur Lehoux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Lobb.
Monsieur Martel.
Monsieur Martel.
Monsieur Gourde.
Monsieur Gourde.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mrs. Falk, Battleford, Lloydminster.
Mrs. Falk, Battleford, Lloydminster.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Falk Provencher.
Mr. Falk Provencher.
Mr. Mott.
Mr. Mott.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Dalton.
Mr. Dalton.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Canna.
Mr. Canna.
Going back to Mr. Fast.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Canna.
Mr. Canna.
Mr. Leslie.
Mr. Leslie.
Mr. Majumdar.
Mr. Majumdar.
Mr. Giovanni.
Mr. Giovanni.
Mr. Vong.
Mr. Hong.
Monsieur Blanchet. Oh, désolé. Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Villemur.
Monsieur Villemur.
Madame Normandin.
Madame Normandin.
Monsieur Simard.
Monsieur Simard.
Monsieur Bergeron.
Monsieur Bergeron.
Monsieur Garon.
Monsieur Garon.
Madame Gill.
Madame Gill.
Monsieur Fortin.
Monsieur Fortin.
Monsieur Thériault.
Monsieur Thériault.
Madame Godreau.
Madame Godreau.
Madame Larouche.
Madame Larouche.
Monsieur Perron.
Monsieur Perron.
Monsieur Barcelo-Duval.
Monsieur Barcelo-Duval.
Madame Posé.
Madame Posé.
Monsieur Champoux.
Monsieur Champoux.
Monsieur Lemire.
Monsieur Lemire.
Madame Saint-Clair-Desgagnés.
Madame Saint-Clair-Desgagnés.
Madame Chabot.
Madame Chabot.
Monsieur Trudel.
Monsieur Trudel.
Madame Bérubé.
Madame Bérubé.
Monsieur Désilet.
Monsieur Désilet.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Julian.
Ms. Matheson.
Miss Matheson.
Ms. McPherson.
Miss McPherson.
Mr. McGregor.
Mr. McGregor.
Ms. Gazan. Apologies. Ms. Barron.
Miss Barron.
Mr. Backrack.
Mr. Backrack.
Mr. Garrison.
Mr. Garrison.
Monsieur Bouleris.
Monsieur Bouleris.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Desjardins.
Mr. Desjardins.
Ms. Collins Victoria.
Miss Collins Victoria.
And Mr. Vong.
Mr. Vaughn.
All those opposed to the amendment will please rise.
Mr. McKinnon-Gatineau.
Mr. McKinnon-Gatineau.
Ms. Hutchings.
Miss Hutchings.
Ms. Tassie.
Miss Tassie.
Ms. Chager.
Miss Chager.
Ms. Murray.
Miss Murray.
Mr. McKay.
Mr. McKay.
Mr. Scarpalegia.
Mr. Scarpalegia.
Ms. Sahota.
Miss Sahota.
Ms. Ian.
Miss Ian.
Madame Le Boutillier.
Madame Le Boutier.
Madame Petitpas-Taylor.
Madame Petitpas-Taylor.
Ms. Jacek.
Miss Jazik.
Monsieur Arsenault.
Monsieur Arsenault.
Madame Lalonde.
Madame Lalonde.
Ms. O'Connell.
Miss O'Connell.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Baptiste.
Mr. Baptiste.
Monsieur Lauzon.
Monsieur Lauzon.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Ms. Dillon.
Miss Dillon.
Mr. Essassi.
Mr. Assassi.
Monsieur El Khoury.
Monsieur El Khoury.
Mr. Fillmore.
Mr. Fillmore.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Sidhu Brampton-East.
Mr. Cedar Brampton East.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Badaway.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mrs. Atwin.
Ms. Vandenbel.
Ms. Vandenbel.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Koutrakis. Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Lightbound.
Mr. Lightbound.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Longfield.
Mr. Longfield.
Monsieur Robillard.
Monsieur Robillard.
Madame Shanahan.
Madame Shanahan.
Ms. Cedar Brampton South.
Ms. Cedar Brampton South.
Ms. Hefner.
Ms. Hefner.
Mr. Turnbull.
Mr. Turnbull.
Mr. Sorbera.
Mr. Sorbera.
Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Rogers.
Ms. Yip.
Ms. Yip.
Mr. Alday.
Mr. Alday.
Mr. Baker.
Mr. Baker.
Ms. Latanzio.
Ms. Latanzio.
Mr. Lewis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Lewis Kitchen-Conestoga.
Madame Mendez.
Madame Mendez.
Mr. Baines.
Mr. Baines.
Ms. Bradford.
Ms. Bradford.
Madame Châtel.
Madame Châtel.
Madame Diab.
Madame Diab.
Madame Lapointe.
Madame Lapointe.
Mr. Meow.
Mr. Meow.
Ms. Taylor-Roy.
Ms. Taylor-Roy.
Ms. Thompson.
Ms. Thompson.
Ms. Gainey.
Ms. Gainey.
La Chambre attendra maintenant la fin de la période de vote.
The House will now wait for the electronic voting period to end before resuming its proceedings.
Anyone new to the channel, please like and subscribe. You can help support the channel with a super chat or sticker, or even becoming a member. After the vote, I will be ending the stream. Hey, Christine. Yeah, they're voting on the carbon tax emergency meeting they had the other day. So to force Trudeau to meet with the first ministers, so the premiers, to discuss the carbon tax on national television. So it's already passed.
Je désire informer la Chambre.
I wish to inform the House that the electronic voting period has ended. The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Island. Yes. It's really the first time it's happened, but Mr. Speaker, I think that when I rose, I did not quite hear my name. I wanted to vote no on the amendment.
Et si les députés n'ont
If members were not able to vote due to technical difficulties, they may now use the raise hand function and the chair will recognise them.
L'honorable député.
The honourable member, Mr. Wilkinson.
I vote no.
All members who are online to please put on a jacket. For those who don't have a jacket on. The honourable member, Mr. Wilkinson.
Mr. Wilkinson, you too.
Mr. McLean.
For the motion.
Monsieur Reyes.
Monsieur le Président, je vote en faveur.
Monsieur Reyes, yé pour.
Madame Zurillo.
Yes.
Mr. Cannings.
I vote in favor.
Also doesn't have a jacket.
As I had mentioned to the other members, if you could please put on a jacket and a tie to be able to vote. He doesn't. You just need a jacket, Mr. Cannings, not a tie, just a jacket. Mr. Cannings.
I hope that does it. I vote in favor.
Cannings, yay pour.
Le bureau va maintenant
The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Il y a deux autres députés.
Two other MPs are rising. The member for Sherbrooke. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was not able to vote on the application, and so I'd like to register as voting against.
Nay contre.
L'honorable député de Milton.
I also tried to vote on the app and it didn't work, and I'd like to vote against.
Mr. Vancouverden, nay contre.
Mr. Veerson.
There's Mr. Veerson online as well.
Mr. Veerson.
I'd like to vote yay.
Mr. Veerson, yay pour.
Le bureau va maintenant compiler les résultats.
The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Yeas pour 173, 173. Nays contre 149, 149.
Je déclare la motion.
I declare the amendment carried.
Excuse-moi. Je déclare l'amendement adopté. La prochaine mise au vote.
The next question is on the main motion as amended. The question is as follows. Mr. Poilievre, seconded by Mr. Motz, moved that the House note A, that the federal carbon tax is causing a debate in the country, and B, that while Quebec, British Columbia and the Northwest Territories already have their own systems in place, the federal government mandates carbon tax policy. That the House call on the Prime Minister to convene an emergency carbon tax and tarification meeting with all of Canada's 14 First Ministers, and that this meeting be publicly televised and held within 5 weeks of this motion being adopted.
If a member participating in person wishes that the motion as amended be carried or carried on division, or if a member of a recognized party participating in person wishes to request a recorded division, I would invite them to rise and indicate it to the chair. The honourable member from Regina Capel.
I believe we should have a recorded division on this.
The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started, and the House will now proceed to the vote for members participating in person. All those in favour of the motion as amended will please rise.
Mr. Scheer.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Perkins.
Mrs. Thomas.
Mrs. Thomas.
Mr. Deltel.
Mr. Deltel.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mr. Paulus.
Mr. Paulus.
Ms. Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Ms. Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Mr. Barrett.
Mr. Barrett.
Mrs. Gray.
Mrs. Gray.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Brock.
Mr. Brock.
Mr. Bertol.
Mr. Bertol.
Ms. Finley.
Ms. Finley.
Mr. Chong.
Mr. Chong.
Mr. Abultaif.
Mr. Abouteff.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mr. Seaback.
Mr. Seaback.
Ms. Ferrari.
Ms. Ferrari.
Mrs. Block.
Mrs. Block.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. McCauley Edmonton West.
Mr. McCauley Edmonton West.
Mr. Lloyd.
Mr. Lloyd.
Mr. Brassard.
Mr. Brassard.
Mrs. Goodrich.
Mrs. Goodrich.
Madame Vien.
Madame Vien.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Tucker.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mr. Vidal.
Mr. Vidal.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Redicott.
Mr. Redicott.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Steinley.
Mr. Stanley.
Ms. Rude.
Ms. Rude.
Monsieur Lehoux.
Monsieur Lehoux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Lobb.
Monsieur Martel.
Monsieur Martel.
Monsieur Gourde.
Monsieur Gould.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mrs. Falk, Battlefield Lloydminster.
Mrs. Falk, Butterfly Lloydminster.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Shield.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Falk Provencher.
Mr. Falk Provencher.
Mr. Motts.
Mr. Motts.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Dalton.
Mr. Dalton.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Khanna.
Mr. Canna.
Mr. Majumdar.
Mr. Majumdar.
Mr. Giovanni.
Mr. Giovanni.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Villemur.
Monsieur Villemur.
Madame Normandin.
Madame Normandin.
Monsieur Simard.
Monsieur Simard.
Monsieur Bergeron.
Monsieur Bergeron.
Monsieur Garon.
Monsieur Garon.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Monsieur Thériault.
Monsieur Thériault.
Madame Godreau.
Madame Godreau.
Madame Larouche.
Madame Larouche.
Monsieur Perron.
Monsieur Perron.
Monsieur Barcelot Duval.
Monsieur Barcelot Duval.
Madame Posé.
Madame Posé.
Monsieur Champoux.
Monsieur Champoux.
Monsieur Lemire.
Monsieur Lemire.
Monsieur Trudel.
Monsieur Trudel.
Madame Bérubé.
Madame Bérubé.
Monsieur Désilet.
Monsieur Désilet.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Julian.
Miss Matheson.
Miss Matheson.
Miss McPherson.
Miss McPherson.
Mr. McGregor.
Mr. McGregor.
Miss Barron.
Miss Barron.
Mr. Backrack.
Mr. Backrack.
Mr. Garrison.
Mr. Garrison.
Monsieur Bouleris.
Monsieur Boudris.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Desjardins.
Mr. Desjardins.
Miss Collins Victoria.
Miss Collins Victoria.
So for those of you that don't understand what just happened, they were actually voting on the amendment to the main motion. So the amendment was introduced by the bloc to state that the bloc that Quebec and BC were not included, basically. But now they're voting on the main motion because the amendment passed. They're voting on the main motion. So once this vote is done, it's passed, it's final. Then it's set in stone that Justin has to meet with the premiers. So this is the main vote. But this motion's already passed too, so it has the same results as the last one.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Badaway.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mrs. Atwin.
Ms. Vandenbeld.
Mrs. Vandenbeld.
Mr. Sanson.
Monsieur Sanson.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Brière.
Madame Brière.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Lightbound.
Mr. Lightbound.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Longfield.
Mr. Longfield.
Monsieur Robillard.
Monsieur Robillard.
Madame Shanahan.
Madame Shanahan.
Miss Cedar Brampton South.
Miss Cedar Brampton South.
Miss Hefner.
Miss Hefner.
Mr. Turnbull.
Mr. Turnbull.
Mr. Sorbera.
Mr. Sorbera.
Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Rogers.
Miss Yip.
Miss Yip.
Mr. Alday.
Mr. Alday.
Mr. Baker.
Mr. Baker.
Miss Latanzio.
Miss Latanzio.
Mr. Louis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Louis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Madame Mendez.
Madame Mendez.
Mr. Baines.
Mr. Baines.
Ms. Bradford.
Miss Bradford.
Madame Châtel.
Madame Châtel.
Madame Diab.
Madame Diab.
Madame Lapointe.
Madame Lapointe.
Mr. Meow.
Mr. Meow.
Miss Taylor Roy.
Miss Taylor Roy.
Miss Valdez. Miss Thompson.
Miss Thompson.
Miss May Saanich Gulf Islands.
Miss May Saanich Gulf Islands.
La Chambre attendra maintenant.
The House will now wait for the electronic voting period to end before resuming its proceedings.
Yeah, when you see the NDP and the bloc stand up in favor, it's already passed. Like, you don't even need to watch anymore. You know it's already passed. Because all they really need is the Conservatives and the NDP and a couple bloc to pass the motion. And they got all of them. So it's definitely passed. Well, the meeting is supposed to convene like 5 weeks from that day that it passes or something like that. So it'll be about a month. Even if it is within 5 weeks, they will probably stretch it out right to the last day. So you can bet that it's going to be about a month before it happens. Because the Liberals have to agree to the time within that 5 weeks. I just seen a conservative that voted no. So I hope that's an accident.
J'aimerais informer la Chambre que
I'd like to inform the House that the electronic voting period has ended. If members were not able to vote due to technical difficulties, they may now use the raise hand function, and the chair will recognize them.
Ms. Zarillo, rather. Ms. Zarillo, your microphone is on mute.
Yes.
Oyez pour.
Mr. Wilkinson.
I vote no.
Mr. Wilkinson, nay, contre.
Mr. McLean.
I vote for this motion.
McLean, yea pour.
Le bureau va maintenant compiler.
The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Yeas pour 172, 172. Nays contre 150, 150.
Je déclare la...
I declare the motion as amended carried. The House will now proceed to the taking of the deferred recorded division on the motion at second reading stage of Bill C-347 under private members' business. The question is as follows. Mr. Arsenault, seconded by Mr. Lightbound, moved that Bill C-347, an act to amend the Constitution Act 1867, Oath of Office, be now read a second time and referred to the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started, and the House will now proceed to the vote. We will start with the sponsor of the item.
Monsieur Arsenault.
We will now proceed to members participating in person. All those at my right in favor of the motion will please rise.
Madame Mendez.
Madame Mendez.
Mr. Weiler.
Mr. Weiler.
Mr. Shahal.
Mr. Shahal.
Madame Diab.
Madame Diab.
Cinquième rangée.
Fifth row.
Mr. Morrissey.
Mr. Morrissey.
Madame Shanahan.
Madame Shanahan.
Mr. Baker.
Mr. Baker.
Mr. Pawlowski.
Mr. Pawlowski.
Quatrième rangée.
Fourth row at my right.
Smith.
Mr. Erskine Smith.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mrs. Atwin.
Monsieur Sanson.
Monsieur Sanson.
Monsieur Serré.
Monsieur Serré.